Thank you so much, Michael. Now, Arthur will comment on your lecture. Maybe you could do your comments in English, just to make it easier for Michael to understand
You
them.
can do it in Portuguese, but you have to speak slowly.
We're going to slip if you spell.
All right. I mean, it's never easy talking about it, talking after an expert, right? So I'll try to make it very short, and I'll use some charts because I think it helps illustrate some points here. Why we care about China? I think it's one of those things. Everyone that's been in Hong Kong has heard this joke at least 20 times. So, Professor Petty, excuse me for that, but I think the joke that goes around Hong Kong is that in 1949, most intellectuals thought that communism would save China, right? By 1969, those same intellectuals, because communism was being questioned after Stalin and Prague Spring and all things like that, they said, okay, China's going to save communism. It's the savior of communism, our cultural revolution. By 1979, I think Deng Xiaoping realized that, well, okay, we need capitalism to save China. And in 2009, we're all reaching the conclusion that only China can save capitalism. So that's why we care, right? I think from a structural point of view, there are some issues in the Chinese economy that are very difficult to understand. And most of them have been addressed here. But one is this issue of an export-based economy versus exporting unplanned surplus. And what I mean unplanned surplus, it implies a coordination issue, right? Because when you go to China and talk to the government, people in the Ministry of Finance, they all say, look, our objective is not to be the widget factor of the world, right? Our objective is to be is to have a healthy domestic economy, right? And all of a sudden, you turn around and there are two flashy new aluminum smelters which the world doesn't need, right? So how that squares out, that's something that is very difficult for a foreigner to understand. And I think it's got a lot to do, what I've learned throughout the years is that the incentives at the federal and the provincial level are fairly different, right? The incentives at the provincial level is I need to generate as much employment as I can, as long as I have free capital, that's what I'm going to do. At the federal, you're worried about consumption and savings over GDP and that kind of things, but at a provincial level, that doesn't square out, and that's one of the one of the few things that we think we need to address here, which is we look at China as a centrally planned economy as being a very homogeneous body, which I think is very far from truth, right? That means that whatever is politically feasible and economically desirable are very contrasting things, which we also tended to think they are very, this dichotomy wouldn't happen in a centrally planned economy as China would say, okay, they need to increase loans, boom, 50% increase year over year in the first 3 months. Well, I think it's more than that. And I think there's the issue of the success of an export-based economy. It is tied to the capacity of your biggest consumer, and your biggest consumer will be the U.S. So if that's the route that China wants to go, it needs to address the issue with the U.S. And you need to figure out one way with this symbiotic relationship to develop without building massive amounts of debt in the U.S., right? I think structurally, when we think about it, there's the bigger issue, right? Can a planned economy allocate capital efficiently, right? I think it's an issue that we sweep under the rug for a while because China has been growing 12, 14%. Okay, this year is going to be 7 or 8. And because there's an inertial component, we forgot about it. But it is a state-planned economy, right? We've seen the model of the allocation of massive amount of capital over excess pool of labor generating, productivity gains. But we also know that there's something called the declining marginal returns, right? And we've seen that in Japan. We've seen that in Brazil in the 70s, right? Will we see that in China this time? Yes, no, when? I think that's questions we would like to answer as well. And the last point, I think we've just dealt with that. It's very difficult to understand the very strong rhetoric against U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency. They don't seem to have a choice. But still, the "we hate you" type of speech is very confusing for someone sitting here in Brazil. So, moving to the issue of policy response. I think you have charts over there. Anyone looking at economic activity in China, last 3 months is saying, well, the policies have worked, right? Economic activity is picking up, domestic absorption is picking up. Fair enough, but I mean, again, are we doing more of the same, right? I mean, what's really picking up is domestic investment, right? I mean, is that going to solve the problem or not? Consumption as a share of GDP has been declining steadily, and would that revert? Will China be able to actually promote some sort of adjustment, right? Why is it important? Well, I mean, last 3 years have been very interesting. We've seen very large current account surpluses in emerging markets, right? But those were easy to explain ex-China. Why we're talking about commodity exporters, which had a massive, inflow of money due to very high commodity prices, right? Those days are gone. Right? If you look right now, China will be responsible this year, according to some estimates, of about 75% of all the current account surpluses in emerging markets, right? That's a percentage that is unprecedented, right? The only other thing that someone's been around enough and looked at this chart is a comparison with the Asian crisis, right? Because in 97, 98, and a lot of people here have been working through that time. I mean, developed markets pointed a finger at us and say, well, you have a problem in emerging markets. You guys don't save enough. Now they come to us and say, well, you have a problem in emerging markets. You guys save too much, right? So it is interesting. I guess the question we have to answer is just a big monetary illusion. And now I'm stealing arguments from Jim Walker, which is a known expert in China and whom I respect too much. And I think in his words, I mean, when we look at China, we undergo something called the suspension of disbelief, right? We think that China is not subject to regular economic laws, right? That kind of monetary increase will lead to something that is very undesirable. Actually, as Professor Parte was referring, I mean, the ratio of M2 to GDP in China is 3 times what it is in the United States, and we're already worried about inflation in the U.S., right? So that's something that we have to address as well. Is it all a monetary illusion or not? On the other hand, I mean, and I am an equity guy, so I have rosy glasses, right? So in some aspects, it's very difficult to pinpoint what we're talking about, right? I mean, yes, I mean we are seeing a significant increase in bank loans, right? But if you look at the top hand chart, I mean, deposits are growing fairly quickly as well. So if you look at the banking system, the bank to deposits, really very few, exception of the last 2 or 3 months, it has been fairly well behaved, right? I mean, extending loans will be the traditional answer to a bank that is seeing an inflow in deposits, right? So that's a puzzle. B, retail sales. And when we look at consumption, I think it's only a small portion of it, but it has been running at double digits, and it has been running at double digits for a very long time. So does it mean it's working? Does it not? I think that's other interesting point to debate. Question, who's saving? And that's not a pun on who's in China. I don't know if someone read this small joke that was going around in the U.S., but that was very surprising to me. I mean, when we break down savings in China and we say the savings to GDP are going up, is it coming in the household sector? Not really. And that's the surprising thing. We think about household in China and a bunch of families saving much more, but they are saving pretty much the same as they did over the last 10 years, right? I mean, what is increasing according to data is actually corporate savings, right? Corporates are hoarding cash. And that's very interesting for a foreign observer, right? Why are we observing that? What's going on? And more importantly, it doesn't mean that the solution of translating lower savings into higher consumption is easier or harder. And I think it's an issue we could talk about here. The trajectory to a more balanced growth. I guess we've heard the opinion, and I apologize. My apologies to Professor Patis, but actually I took that from your blog, right?
Oh, okay.
So
that's right.
What is truly the government view? Do they really want to promote growth based on domestic absorption or not? It's just purely rhetoric. I mean, is there a dichotomy between federal and provincial? Who's going to win this argument? I think that's an important issue here. FX policy, I think we all agree. If China, one way of actually shifting your axis of developing from external to domestic absorption is revaluing your currency. That will mean you have to incur some amount of pain in the short term, but it solves a lot of problems. Why aren't they doing it, right? And again, the question of diffusion of credit policies. When we see a state-owned enterprise borrowing $35 billion and not knowing what to do with that, I mean, the evidence that we've seen so far is that small and medium enterprises are starving for capital, right? So is there an easy way to get out of this, gridlock? I mean, is there a policy that will address this issue? Will they implement it? Do they want to implement it? And I think that's the question. So to conclude, and I wanted to be very, very brief, I think we all know that, we cannot have an adjustment, a global adjustment, without having China adjust, right? I mean, we've just seen that, the current account deficit in the U.S. is a mirror image of Chinese current account surpluses. As long as they hold one, I mean, the Chinese will hold a current, or someone else will have a massive imbalance, which will keep a dagger over our hearts. How to shift the axis of growth from net exports to domestic absorption, right? I mean, one, from the point of view whether they want to do it, whether they understand that's the problem, and B, okay, if they want to do it, how would they do it, right? The impact of FX policy, right? I mean, will simply appreciating currency solve the issue? Can they handle that politically when they see unemployment increasing and, even more idle capacity in the export sector? The issue of short-term adjustment versus long-term gains. This is one of the things that we thought that a centrally planned economy with a limited degree of democracy, and that's not an insult, but I mean, should be able to handle better than a democracy, right? I mean, there's something that we question a lot in our adjustment processes in Latin America. We always said, well, democracy is in the way. Well, theoretically, it's not in China, but still it's difficult enough, right? Which reverts us back to the point of, politics versus economics. What is politically desirable versus what is economically desirable versus what is politically feasible. So from my point of view, these are the issues we should be talking here. Thank you.